When you picture the ultimate symbol of American grit, that classic Western loner squinting into the sun, you probably imagine someone who was raised out on the dusty plains, right?
Oh, absolutely. A guy practically born on a horse, miles away from civilization.
Exactly. But the individual who became the literal face of that archetype, this hyper-masculine, trigger-happy anti-hero of the 20th century, he actually grew up in a super affluent California town.
Yeah, his family had a swimming pool.
Right. They belong to a country club. And the man himself, he is a massive health fanatic. He avoids hard liquor. He's a dedicated practitioner of transcendental meditation, which, by the way, he adopted way back in the 70s. And he's a passionate jazz pianist.
I mean, the contrast between the cultural myth we all know and his actual biographical reality is just staggering. You have this figure who built a whole empire playing men of violence and whiskey, but off-screen, he's quietly scoring his own films with these delicate jazz compositions and focusing on holistic wellness.
It's wild. So to you, our listener joining us at the table today, welcome to the deep dive. We are going way beyond the squint and the revolver to examine the legendary Clint Eastwood.
We really are. And to figure out how this specific image was constructed, we're pulling from a massive stack of sources today.
Yeah, we've got decades of historical film criticism, box office data, public legal documents from his lawsuits, and some incredibly extensive deep dive biographies. Our mission here is to understand how an amateur actor, who, by the way, was literally mocked by studio executives for speaking through his teeth, somehow sees total control of his career.
Right. We want to uncover how he meticulously built his own mythos to become one of Hollywood's most successful, uncompromising directors. A guy who only recently hung up his hat in 2026.
We are looking at a trajectory that spans 7 decades. And to really grasp how he managed to survive the studio system, we kind of have to look at his earliest attempts to fit into the Hollywood mold.
Which were categorized by an almost comical level of friction, honestly.
Oh, yeah. Even his entry into the world sounds like a tall tale from a Western.
Oh, the Samson thing.
Yes. The nurses at the hospital in San Francisco nicknamed him Samson at birth because he weighed an astonishing 11 pounds, 6 ounces.
That is a massive baby.
Right. But his path to Hollywood wasn't some preordained journey. He worked as a lifeguard, a paper carrier, a forest firefighter. And then he was drafted into the army during the Korean War, which ultimately led to a survival story that genuinely sounds like the inciting incident of an action film.
You're talking about the 1951 bomber crash.
Exactly.
Yeah, so he was a passenger on a Douglas AD bomber, returning from what the historical sources delicately describe as a prearranged tryst in Seattle.
Tryst, yes.
Right. And the plane literally runs out of fuel in flight and crashes directly into the freezing ocean near Point Reyes, California.
Just plunging into the Pacific.
Yeah, and Eastwood and the pilot are forced to abandon the wreckage, rely on a life raft, and physically swim 2 miles to the shore.
2 miles. I mean, surviving a trauma like that, a literal 2-mile swim in the freezing Pacific, it fundamentally changes a person's perspective on risk,
Definitely.
So when he gets discharged in 1953 and decides to try his hand at acting, you'd think he'd have this fearless aura. But his early auditions were, well, they were disastrous.
Yeah, they really were.
Okay, let's unpack this. He lands an audition with a director named Arthur Lubin. Now, Lubin liked his physical stature, obviously, since Eastwood is a towering 6'4", but his assessment of the actual acting was brutal.
Oh, it was harsh. Lubin famously said he was quite amateurish, didn't know which way to turn or what to do with his body.
Which is crazy to think about now.
It is, but the primary point of contention was his vocal delivery. You have to remember, the standard for Hollywood acting in the 1950s was highly polished. Actors were trained to project, to speak clearly with this sort of theatrical diction.
All right, that mid-Atlantic accent kind of thing.
Exactly. But Eastwood was stiff, and he had this habit of delivering his lines in a low whisper, clenching his jaw and speaking through his teeth. Universal actually dropped his contract because of it.
The irony there is almost painful to think about, that through the teeth whisper is the very foundation of his lifelong trademark.
Right. A thing that gets him fired in the 50s becomes the thing that makes him a billionaire later on.
It's unbelievable, but in the short term, he's basically relegated to these tiny, uncredited roles until 1958, when he finally lands a regular spot on the television show Rawhide.
And playing Rowdy Yates on Rawhide really made him a household name. I mean, it was a highly successful run. By the end of the show's lifespan in 1965, his contract was so lucrative, he received up to $119,000 an episode just in severance pay.
Wow.
But the financial security masked this deep, growing resentment toward the material.
Yeah, and to put that resentment into perspective for you guys listening, think about the mechanics of the music industry. Imagine a pop star who gets insanely famous for a catchy, super sanitized teen bop song.
Okay, yeah.
They make millions, but secretly they listen to dark, abrasive indie rock, and they are desperate to smash their guitar on stage instead of performing these choreographed dance routines.
That is a great analogy.
That was Eastwood on Rawhide. He was pushing 30, yet he felt totally trapped playing the conventional white hat hero.
Yeah.
You know, the guy whose job it was to kiss old ladies and dogs.
Yeah, he hated it. He found the character cloddish and entirely disconnected from the shifting, more finical culture of the late 50s and early 60s.
Exactly.
And that intense frustration with the sanitized television landscape serves as the primary catalyst for his entire career pivot. He realizes that if he stays in the American studio system, he will be pigeonholed as a Boy Scout forever. So he actively seeks out the polar opposite, looking outside the traditional Hollywood apparatus.
Right, and an opportunity arrives when another actor on Rawhide turns down a role in an Italian-made Western.
Which was a weird move at the time.
Super weird. The director is this relatively unknown Italian named Sergio Leone. The project seems like a massive step down from primetime American television. But Eastwood takes it, largely because they offer him $15,000 and a bonus Mercedes-Benz.
A pretty good squeaker.
Yeah. And the film, of course, is a fistful of dollars. But how did an Italian production manage to completely reinvent an American cowboy?
What's fascinating here is Leone's objective was to dismantle the traditional American Western myth. He wasn't interested in white hats and moral clarity,
You're right.
He wanted a lawless, desolate world populated by morally ambiguous anti-heroes. But he needed a visual anchor for this new cinematic language. And Leone famously forced Eastwood to adopt a specific prop, the cigar.
Which is so interesting because, like we mentioned, Eastwood was deeply invested in his physical health.
Yeah, he was a total non-smoker.
Exactly. He was famously doing push-ups for TV guide spreads and advocating against refined sugar. Putting a cheap cigar in his mouth was entirely against his nature.
But Leone insisted on it because he felt he needed a mask more than he needed an actor. Leone bluntly stated that at that time, Eastwood only had two facial expressions, with the hat and without the hat.
Ouch, that is brutal.
I know, it's a really harsh assessment. But forcing him to smoke that cigar was a stroke of mechanical genius. When you clench a cigar between your teeth, it physically alters your facial muscles. It forces you to squint against the smoke.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it forces you to minimize your jaw movement and speak through your teeth,
Yeah.
which is the very vocal habit Universal had penalized him for earlier.
That is so wild. It just stripped away his ability to overact, creating this intense economy of words. The less the man with no name said, the more the audience projected their own ideas of power onto him.
Exactly, and the global audience just devoured it. The Dollars trilogy transforms him into an international sensation.
Right, and when he returns to the United States, he brings that exact anti-hero archetype with him. He trades the dusty plains for the concrete streets of modern San Francisco.
Dirty Harry.
Yes. In 1971, he introduces us to the loose cannon cop in Dirty Harry. He points a .44 Magnum revolver at a suspect, asks, "Do I feel lucky?" and single-handedly causes sales of that specific firearm to skyrocket across the country.
It's crazy. But while the box office numbers were staggering, the critical reception paints a wildly different picture of his cultural standing at the time.
What do you mean?
Well, the American critical establishment had visceral, negative reactions to these films. They dismissed the Dollars trilogy as cheapjack.
Cheapjack.
Yeah. The New York Times literally labeled the final installment the most repellent movie in the history of its peculiar genre. And Dirty Harry faced severe intellectual backlash, with high-profile critics widely slamming the film's vigilante messaging as overtly fascistic.
But wait, if the critics hated him, and he was basically playing a monosyllabic cartoon character, how did he avoid becoming a flash-in-the-pan action star? I mean, we've seen dozens of action stars arrive, play a guy who just shoots people, and then fade into obscurity within 5 years. How did he solidify his position when the gatekeepers of the industry despised his work?
Well, he survived because he accurately read the psychological climate of the era. The late 1960s and early 1970s were defined by massive social upheaval, rising crime rates, and a general sense that institutional authority was failing.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
So while the critics were analyzing the films through a lens of high art and political theory, the global audience was connecting with the raw, emotional catharsis of a character who just bypassed broken bureaucracy to deliver immediate justice.
Right. They just wanted someone to get the job done.
Exactly. And more importantly, regarding his career survival, Eastwood realized that studio executives and critics are fickle. To ensure longevity, he knew he had to own the means of production himself.
So what is his literal first step to seizing those reins? Because taking on the major studios in the late 60s, that was no small feat.
Not at all. He took the capital he generated from the Dollars trilogy and, working closely with his advisor, formed his own production company in 1967. He named it Malpaso Productions, taking the name from Malpaso Creek, which ran through his property in California. Yeah, by establishing Malpaso, he was no longer just an actor for hire. And by 1971, he placed himself in the director's chair for the very first time with a film called Play Misty for Me, which was a thriller about a jazz DJ stalked by an obsessed fan.
And this transition into directing reveals so much about his psychology as an actor, because when he takes control of the set, he completely rejects the traditional Hollywood directing methods that he hated being subjected to.
Absolutely.
He despised directors who demanded 20 takes of a single scene while they slowly figured out the blocking. So as a director, he institutes this environment of ruthless efficiency.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, his methodology is practically unheard of in modern filmmaking. He rarely uses storyboards to plan his shots. He actively avoids rehearsing scenes with his actors beforehand.
Wow, no rehearsals.
Nope. His preference is to shoot on the very first take to capture raw spontaneity rather than a polished, rehearsed performance. And the mechanical result of this approach is that his productions consistently wrap under budget and ahead of schedule.
That's incredible.
For example, he directed a film in 1973 called Breezy, starring William Holden. He finished the entire production 3 days early and a full $1 million under the allocated budget.
$1 million under budget in the 70s is huge. And that kind of financial discipline gives an artist incredible leverage. When you're saving the studio's money, they leave you alone.
Exactly.
And that lack of interference allowed him to take some truly bizarre risks. If we look at the historical box office data, his absolute commercial peak in the late 1970s wasn't a gritty crime thriller or a Western. It was a film called Every Which Way But Loose.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, a really strange comedy where he plays a bare-knuckle brawler roaming the American West with an orangutan named Clyde.
And the critics, predictably, panned the film entirely.
Completely. But the audiences showed up in droves. It became the second highest-grossing film of 1978.
It's wild. But the broader implication of that success is critical to understanding his power in Hollywood. We have to look at what his contemporaries were doing at the time. Directors like Francis Ford Coppola and Michael Cimino were leading the new Hollywood movement, but they were increasingly bogged down in massive, bloated productions with spiraling budgets.
Right, which invited intense studio interference.
Exactly. But Eastwood's speed, his low overhead, and his undeniable box office draw meant he existed in an insulated bubble. He wasn't battling studio executives for final cutting. He was delivering finished, highly profitable films on a silver platter.
Okay, I understand the financial benefit of shooting everything on the first take without rehearsal, but how does that method actually yield high-quality art? If you look at the later stages of his career, he directed actors like Sean Penn, Tim Robbins, Morgan Freeman, and Hilary Swank to Academy Award-winning performances. If he never rehearses and does everything in one take, how on earth did he manage to direct so many actors to Academy Award-winning performances later on?
It really comes down to the psychological environment he creates on set. Because he casts meticulously, he trusts the actors to arrive already knowing the character. And the actors who have worked with him consistently note how unbelievably calm a Malpaso set is. Think about the normal theatricality of filmmaking. The loud bell ringing, a director screaming, "Action!" and then yelling, "Cut!" It literally causes an actor's cortisol levels to spike. It reminds them they are performing.
That makes total sense.
Eastwood eliminates that entirely. He simply points a finger and quietly says, "Go ahead."
Yeah.
And when the scene ends, he just says, "Stop." By removing all that high-pressure fanfare and instituting a one-take expectation, actors strip away their performative habits and rely purely on their immediate, genuine instincts.
Wow. That reliance on raw instinct didn't just save money, it fundamentally changed the types of performances he captured, which is exactly why the critical establishment and the Academy finally had to take him seriously.
Yes, they did.
And that shift marks a fascinating second half of his career, where the man who spent decades building the myth of the violent, hyper-masculine lone wolf dedicates his twilight years to systematically deconstructing it.
And the pivotal moment of that deconstruction really arrives in 1992, with the film Unforgiven.
Oh, what a movie.
Yeah, he plays William Money, a former ruthless killer who is now this aging, remorseful widower struggling to even mount his horse. The film basically strips away all the glamour of violence that his earlier characters championed.
And the mechanics behind the making of Unforgiven show an incredible level of strategic patience from him. The sources show he actually acquired the script back in 1976.
Wait, really? 1976?
Yes, but he intentionally shelved it for over 15 years.
Oh, wow.
He knew that to play a man haunted by a lifetime of violence, the actor playing him needed the actual physical weight of old age and the cultural baggage of having been the ultimate cinematic gunfighter. He waited until his own myth was heavy enough to lend the character absolute authenticity.
That is brilliant.
Right, and that patience resulted in 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director.
And it forced a complete reappraisal of his entire legacy. The actor, who was once fired for his stiff delivery and mocked for his reliance on cheap props, was now globally recognized as a master filmmaker.
Yeah, a total turnaround.
And he maintained that momentum. In 2004, he released Million Dollar Baby, winning Best Picture and Best Director again, which officially made him the oldest director in history to helm 2 Best Picture winners. And he just kept going, directing well into his 90s, only concluding his career with Juror Number 2 in 2026.
It's an unmatched run. But while he was busy exploring the emotional toll of violence and deconstructing his stoic on-screen persona, the deep dive biographies reveal a personal life that was immensely chaotic.
Very chaotic.
The image of the solitary, disciplined lone wolf completely fractures when you look at his actual family dynamics.
Yeah, the reality of his personal life was this sprawling, complicated network of relationships that, for decades, was shielded from the public eye by an incredibly effective PR apparatus.
Let's examine the specifics from the biographical sources, because it's a lot. He has been legally married twice, but he has 8 known children by 6 different women.
Wow.
And the timelines of these relationships are not sequential. They overlap considerably. Several of his children were kept completely out of the public eye or remained unacknowledged by him for years.
Which is hard to even imagine today.
Right. And when these overlapping relationships inevitably fractured, the fallout occasionally breached the walls of his privacy. Most notably in 1989, when his former long-term partner, the actress Sandra Locke, filed a massive palimony lawsuit.
Right, and palimony being a legal claim for financial support after the dissolution of a non-marital relationship. She subsequently sued him for fraud, alleging he deliberately sabotaged her directing career, which eventually led to out-of-court settlements.
So how does someone with such a deeply messy, overlapping personal life maintain an ironclad public image of discipline and stoicism? I mean, in today's media landscape, those kinds of lawsuits and secret families would dominate the news cycle and completely redefine a celebrity's entire persona.
Well, he benefited immensely from the era in which his stardom peaked, a time way before the 24-hour digital news cycle. But more importantly, his independence was his shield.
How so?
Because he operated Malpaso Productions almost like an independent fortress, he didn't rely on traditional studio PR departments. He kept his inner circle incredibly tight. He controlled the flow of information by controlling the people he employed and worked with, ensuring his private life remained largely separate from his public mythos.
That desire for independence bleeds directly into his civic and political life, too, which is honestly just as contradictory as his personal life.
Oh, absolutely.
You really can't map his political ideology on a standard grid. It acts more like a localized weather system, constantly shifting based on the immediate climate of whatever issue he happens to be facing.
Yeah, he has long been a registered libertarian, reflecting this deep-seated skepticism of government intervention. But he didn't just observe politics from the sidelines, he actively entered local government. In 1986, he successfully ran for the nonpartisan position of mayor in the town of Carmel by the Sea, California.
And he took the job for a salary of $200 a month, which he promptly donated. And you know what the defining legislative victory of his tenure was?
The ice cream thing.
Yes. Spearheading the effort to legalize the consumption of ice cream on the city streets, overturning an old zoning ordinance.
Which is so funny. But while overturning an ice cream ban sounds like a trivial anecdote, it perfectly encapsulates his specific brand of anti-bureaucracy politics. He fundamentally dislikes arbitrary rules that dictate human behavior.
Right.
However, on the national stage, his political interventions have been highly unpredictable. During the 2012 Republican National Convention, he delivered a widely publicized, completely unscripted primetime speech to an empty chair, literally addressing it as if President Barack Obama were sitting right there.
Yeah, it was the surreal moment of political theater that he later admitted he regretted. But if people assumed that speech cemented his identity as a staunch partisan conservative, he pivoted again.
He did.
In 2020, this icon of tough guy Americana publicly endorsed Democrat Michael Bloomberg for president. His rationale was that he wished the current political climate was more genteel and devoid of name-calling. And I just want to clarify, our goal here isn't to evaluate the merits of those political choices, but simply to point out that the moment the public or the media tries to neatly categorize him, he actively defies that categorization.
It's so true. It reveals a man who was entirely comfortable existing in a state of contradiction,
Yeah.
answering only to his own internal logic rather than party lines or public expectations.
So what does this all mean? When we synthesize all these sources, the box office data, the biographies, the legal records, what is the central mechanism of this story? We are looking at a man who spends his mornings practicing silent meditation and his evenings composing jazz music. He is a polyamorous patriarch with a sprawling family tree, a political independent who debates empty chairs while pleading for civility, and a cinematic giant who shoots Oscar-winning performances on the very first take.
The foundational takeaway here is that Clint Eastwood realized at the very genesis of his career that the Hollywood machinery would grind him down and dictate his identity if he allowed it. His entire trajectory is basically a masterclass in seizing the narrative.
Exactly. Had he internalized Arthur Lubin's critique in the 1950s, he might have spent years taking vocal lessons to fix his clenched jaw delivery, smoothing out his rough edges until he became just another generic, forgettable bit player.
Right.
Instead, he weaponized his own limitations. He took his stillness, his stiffness, and his whispered intensity and engineered them into a billion-dollar brand. He built a fortress with Malpaso Productions, ensuring he would never have to ask permission to tell a story or answer to a studio executive ever again.
Which brings us to a really crucial concept for you, the listener, to mull over as we conclude today. Consider the mechanics of the modern entertainment industry. We exist in an ecosystem heavily defined by algorithmic content generation, massive corporate studio interference, focus groups, and heavily sanitized, PR-managed celebrity personas.
It really forces a provocative question. Will the landscape of modern media ever allow a single artist to maintain that kind of uncompromising, monopolistic control over their image, their production, and their art for over 7 decades? Or is the era of the true Hollywood lone wolf permanently closed? It is definitely something to think about the next time you see that iconic squint on screen. The man behind it wasn't just playing a character, he was the absolute architect of his own enduring myth. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the surface of the stories you consume, and keep exploring the history around you. We will catch you next time.